I stood at my husband's funeral watching a woman sob harder than I was, until she approached me with two children who had his exact eyes. That should have been my first warning that everything I knew about Simon Fraser was a lie. But what she didn't know was that I was about to inherit something that would change all our lives forever. The morning of Simon's funeral began like every terrible morning since the phone call that shattered my world. I woke up alone in our king-sized bed, the silence of our Beacon Hill townhouse so complete it felt like it might swallow me whole. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The coffee maker gurgled to life, a sound that had once meant comfort and routine, but now only emphasized how empty everything had become. I sat at our granite kitchen island, the same spot where Simon used to read me interesting articles from the financial section while I prepared breakfast, and stared at the obituary I'd written 3 days earlier. Simon Donovan Fraser, beloved, husband, devoted son, successful investment banker. The words looked foreign on the crisp newspaper page, as if they were describing a stranger rather than the man I'd shared my life with for 8 years. But then again, as I would soon discover, maybe they were describing a stranger. I'd chosen a black Armani dress, one Simon had bought me for our 5th anniversary dinner at the Four Seasons. He'd always said I looked elegant in black, that it brought out the intelligence in my eyes. My brilliant wife, he used to call me, usually when he was trying to charm his way out of working late again or missing another dinner reservation. I wondered now if those compliments had been genuine or simply another manipulation I'd been too trusting to recognize. The funeral home was more crowded than I'd expected when I arrived. Whitmore and Associates funeral directors had prepared their largest chapel, but even so, people spilled into the lobby and gathered in small clusters throughout the building. I recognized most of the faces, colleagues from Simon's investment firm, neighbors from our exclusive neighborhood, friends from the country club where we played tennis on Sunday afternoons. But there were others, too. Faces I'd never seen before. People who seemed to know intimate details about Simon's life, who spoke about him with the familiarity of close relationships I knew nothing about. I took my place in the front row, accepting condolences with the practiced grace my mother had taught me years ago. "Thank you for coming," I repeated dozens of times, shaking hands and accepting embraces from people whose sympathy felt genuine, but somehow incomplete, as if they were mourning a different version of Simon than the one I'd known. "Such a tragedy," murmured Mrs. Kress from the townhouse next door, squeezing my hand with her papery fingers. "Simon was always so helpful with our packages when we were traveling, such a thoughtful young man." "He spoke of you often," said a distinguished older gentleman I didn't recognize, his expensive suit and gold watch suggesting he moved in Simon's professional circles. "He was so proud of your achievements." That comment stuck with me. Simon proud of my achievements? He'd always been supportive, certainly. But proud seemed like a strong word for a man who often seemed distracted when I talked about my work. Then again, maybe I'd been too focused on my own career to notice his pride. The woman appeared during the viewing, about an hour before the service was scheduled to begin. I noticed her immediately, not because she was particularly striking, though she was pretty in an understated way, but because of how she was crying. Her grief was raw, uncontrolled, the kind of deep sobbing that spoke of profound loss. She stood at the back of the room holding the hands of two children, a boy who looked about 10 and a girl who might have been 7 or 8. And all 3 of them were staring at Simon's casket with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. The children were well dressed in what was clearly their best clothes, the kind of formal attire that children wear to important events they don't fully understand. The boy kept wiping his nose with a tissue, trying to be brave, while the girl held tight to what appeared to be a stuffed animal partially hidden in her coat pocket. They looked lost, confused, and heartbroken in a way that made my chest tighten with unexpected emotion. But it was their faces that stopped my breath. The boy had Simon's distinctive cleft chin, the same one I'd traced with my finger countless times during lazy Sunday mornings in bed. The girl had his unusual green eyes, the color of sea glass, that had been one of the first things I'd noticed when we met at a charity fundraiser 8 years ago. These weren't casual resemblances. These were genetic markers as clear as a signature. The woman noticed me watching and began walking in my direction, her steps hesitant but determined. As she got closer, I could see that she was probably in her early 30s, with auburn hair pulled back in a simple bun and minimal makeup that couldn't hide her obvious exhaustion. She was wearing a black dress that looked expensive but not ostentatious, paired with pearls that seemed like genuine heirlooms rather than fashion accessories. "Excuse me," she said when she reached me, her voice soft but steady despite her tears. "Are you Samantha?" The question hit me like ice water. How did this stranger know my name? How did she know to find me here, at my husband's funeral, among hundreds of mourners? "Yes," I replied carefully, studying her face for any clue about who she might be. "I'm sorry, did you work with Simon?" Her expression shifted through a series of emotions I couldn't quite read: surprise, confusion, and something that might have been pity. She glanced down at the children beside her, then back at me, as if trying to solve a puzzle that didn't make sense. "I'm Carrie," she said quietly, her voice barely audible above the hushed conversations around us. "Simon's wife." The words seemed to hang in the air between us, impossible and yet undeniable. My first instinct was to laugh. Surely this was some kind of mistake, a case of mistaken identity or confused grief. But as I looked into her eyes, I saw the same shock and bewilderment that I was feeling, the same desperate need for this to be a misunderstanding. "That's not possible," I managed to say, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. "I'm his wife. We've been married for 8 years. Carrie's face went pale, and I watched her grip the children's hands more tightly, as if anchoring herself against a storm she hadn't seen coming. 12 years, she whispered, her eyes filling with fresh tears. "We've been married for 12 years. These are our children, Henry and Louisa." I stared at the children, Henry and Louisa Fraser, if what this woman was saying was true. Henry, who had Simon's stubborn cowlick that never lay flat no matter how much hair gel he used. Louisa, who had not only his eyes, but also his habit of tilting her head slightly when she was thinking about something serious. The funeral home suddenly felt too small, too crowded, too full of people who might know secrets I didn't. My carefully constructed world, the world where I was Simon Fraser's wife, where we had a good marriage and a comfortable life and plans for the future, began to crumble around me like a house of cards in a hurricane. But even as shock and betrayal washed over me in waves, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered something that Carrie Fraser had no way of knowing: that I wasn't just Simon's grieving widow. I was Samantha Wellington, senior partner at one of Boston's most prestigious law firms, specializing in estate planning and inheritance law. And if Simon had been living a double life, if he'd been deceiving both of us for years, then there were going to be legal consequences that would affect all of us in ways none of us could imagine. What Carrie didn't know, what no one in that funeral home knew except me, was that Simon's death was about to trigger a series of revelations that would expose not just his deceptions, but a family secret that would change everything we thought we understood about inheritance, loyalty, and justice. The reading of Simon's will was scheduled for the following Tuesday, and I was the only one who knew what it contained. The funeral director, Mr. Whitmore, appeared beside us with the practiced discretion of someone who had witnessed every conceivable family crisis over 30 years in the business. His silver hair was perfectly combed, his black suit impeccable, and his expression carefully neutral as he assessed the tension radiating between Carrie and me. "Ladies," he said in the soft, measured tone that funeral directors seem to perfect, "perhaps we should continue this conversation in my private office. The service will be beginning shortly, and I believe you may need some privacy to discuss. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Family matters. I nodded numbly, still trying to process what I was hearing. Carrie gathered her children closer, whispering something to Henry that made him nod solemnly before taking his sister's hand. The four of us followed Mr. Whitmore through a side door marked private and down a carpeted hallway lined with tasteful floral arrangements. His office was exactly what I would have expected: mahogany furniture, soft lighting, and the kind of expensive comfort designed to ease grief while discussing practical matters. Carrie and I sat across from each other in leather chairs that seemed too formal for the surreal conversation we were about to have, while Henry and Louisa settled on a small sofa with coloring books that Mr. Whitmore produced from a cabinet with practiced efficiency. "I don't understand any of this," I said, my voice sounding stronger than I felt. "Simon and I were married 8 years ago at St. Paul's Cathedral. We had a reception at the Harbor Hotel, 300 guests." Carrie reached into her purse with trembling hands, pulling out her phone. "We were married at the same cathedral," she said, scrolling through photos with the desperate urgency of someone trying to prove their own existence. 12 years ago this October. It was a small ceremony, just family and close friends. She turned the phone toward me, and my world shifted on its axis. There was Simon, unmistakably Simon, standing at the altar of St. Paul's Cathedral in a tuxedo I'd never seen. He was younger, his hair slightly longer, but it was definitely him, and beside him stood Carrie in a simple white dress, both of them, glowing with the kind of happiness I remembered from my own wedding day. "This was our first dance," she continued, swiping to the next photo. To "At Last" by Etta James. He said it was perfect because he'd waited his whole life to find me. The song choice hit me like a physical blow. Simon had insisted on the same song for our first dance, telling me the exact same romantic story about waiting his whole life. I watched Carrie's face as she scrolled through more photos, their honeymoon in Tuscany, which was eerily similar to the trip Simon and I had taken to Italy for our 5th anniversary. Birthday celebrations, Christmas mornings, everyday moments. That painted a picture of a complete, loving marriage. "When did you meet him?" I asked, dreading the answer. 15 years ago at a charity auction for children's cancer research. He was bidding on a weekend getaway package, and I was there representing the marketing firm that organized the event. Carrie's voice grew softer as she remembered. He was so charming, so confident. He said he was an investment banker who specialized in helping families plan for their futures. My hands began to shake. I had met Simon at a charity fundraiser 13 years ago, the same type of event, possibly even organized by the same firm. He'd been bidding on art pieces that night, and when I'd outbid him on a painting by a local artist, he'd approached me afterward to congratulate me on my excellent taste and competitive spirit. "What about children?" I asked, looking at Henry and Louisa, who were quietly coloring but clearly listening to every word. "When were they born?" "Henry is 11, born in 2012. Louisa is 8, born in 2015. Carrie's voice cracked slightly. Simon was in the delivery room for both births. He cried when Henry took his first steps, and he taught Louisa how to ride a bike last summer. The timeline was devastating. Henry had been born during the 2nd year of my marriage to Simon. I remembered that time clearly. Simon had been traveling more frequently for work, often gone for days at a time on what he called complex client situations. I'd been building my practice at the law firm, working long hours and trusting that our marriage was solid enough to weather the temporary separation that demanding careers sometimes required. "He travels a lot for work," I said, more to myself than to Carrie. 3 or 4 days a week, sometimes longer for big deals. Carrie nodded sadly. "He told me the same thing. He said his work required him to be in New York and Washington frequently, that high-level investment banking meant irregular, Schedules and last-minute trips. New York and Washington, I repeated slowly. He told me he traveled to Chicago and Atlanta for his major clients. We sat in silence for a moment, both of us beginning to understand the scope of Simon's deception. He hadn't just been unfaithful, he had been living two completely separate lives, with two wives, two families, two entirely different versions of himself. Mrs. Fraser, I said carefully, testing how the name sounded. What was Simon's full name on your marriage certificate? Simon Donovan Fraser, she replied immediately. Same as it's always been. I pulled out my own phone and showed her a photo of our marriage certificate that I kept in my digital files for legal purposes. Mine says Simon Donovan Fraser as well. Carrie stared at the image, her face growing pale. That's impossible. You can't be married to the same person with the same name at the same time. Actually, I said, my legal training finally kicking, in through the shock, you can, if one of the marriages is fraudulent. Someone could use false documentation, forged papers, or stolen identity information to marry multiple people. The implications hung heavy in the air between us. One of our marriages, possibly both, might not be legally valid. Our entire understanding of our relationships with Simon, our legal rights, our financial security, everything could be built on lies. There's something else, Carrie said hesitantly. Simon always handled all our financial matters. He said I didn't need to worry about investments and taxes, that his expertise meant I could focus on raising the children and my part-time design. Work! My stomach dropped. He handled ours too. Always said it was easier since he understood the market complexities. Do you know what assets he had? Bank accounts, investments, property? Some, I admitted. But he was always vague about the details, said he preferred to surprise me with good news rather than worry me with market fluctuations. Carrie's expression grew more troubled. He told me we had substantial savings and investment accounts, but I never saw the statements. He said everything was in a trust structure for tax purposes. As a lawyer specializing in estate planning, I knew exactly how dangerous it was for spouses to be completely excluded from financial knowledge. But as Simon's wife, or whatever I actually was to him, I had trusted him completely. The irony wasn't lost on me that I spent my professional life helping other families organize their assets and plan for inheritance issues, while remaining blind to the potential fraud in my own marriage. The funeral service is about to begin, Mr. Whitmore said quietly, appearing in the doorway. I'm sorry to interrupt, but the chapel is full, and we should start on time. Carrie and I looked at each other, two women who had just discovered that everything we thought we knew about our lives was potentially a lie, about to sit through a memorial service for a man who had deceived us both. We need to talk more after this, I said. There are legal implications we need to understand. Legal implications? Carrie asked, fear creeping into her voice. His will, his assets, the children's rights? Everything depends on which marriage was legitimate, if either of them was. I paused, watching her process this information. I'm an estate planning attorney, Carrie. This is going to get very complicated. Very quickly. Walking back into the chapel felt like entering a theater where I was both performer and audience member in a play I didn't understand. Carrie and I had agreed to sit separately during the service. She would take a seat in the aide middle section with Henry and Louisa, while I maintained my position in the front row as Simon's official widow. The arrangement felt surreal, like we were conspirators in maintaining a fiction that had already been shattered. As I settled back into my designated seat, I found myself scanning the crowd with new eyes. Every face now represented a potential clue, every mourner a possible piece of the puzzle that had been Simon's double life. The elderly woman who had mentioned Marcus speaking of me often. Which version of Simon's life had she known? The business colleagues who nodded respectfully in my direction, had they ever met Carrie or heard about children Simon never mentioned in my presence? Reverend Wellington, no relation, despite sharing my maiden name, began the service with traditional words of comfort that seemed to echo from a great distance. We gather today to celebrate the life of Simon Donovan Fraser, a man who touched many lives during his time with us. The irony of that statement wasn't lost on me. Simon had indeed touched many lives, though perhaps not in the way the Reverend intended. The first speaker was James Kress, Simon's business partner at Fraser & Associates Investment Management. I had met James countless times at company functions and holiday parties, and his presence at the podium felt like the most normal thing that had happened in the past hour. Simon was the kind of partner every businessman hopes to find, James began, his voice carrying clearly through the chapel's sound system. Dedicated, trustworthy, and absolutely committed to his client's success. He often worked late into the evening, sometimes staying overnight at the office when markets in Asia required his attention. I felt a chill run down my spine. The nights Simon had claimed to be working late, the overnight stays at the office. Had he been with Carrie and the children instead? I glanced back toward the middle section and caught Carrie's eye. Her expression mirrored my own growing suspicion. Simon frequently traveled for client meetings, James continued, sometimes for days at a time. His dedication was remarkable. He would reschedule personal plans without hesitation if a client needed his expertise. The personal plans he rescheduled. How many dinners had I eaten alone because Simon had a client emergency? How many weekend trips had we postponed because of his professional obligations? And all the while, was he maintaining a perfect attendance record at Henry's Little League games and Louisa's dance recitals? The next speaker was Simon's college roommate, Damian Whitmore, who had flown in from California for the funeral. Damian's speech focused on Simon's younger years, painting a picture of a charming, ambitious young man who had always been skilled at making people feel special. Simon had this incredible ability to make you feel like you were the most important person in the room, Damian said with a fond smile. He was a natural salesman, but not in a pushy way. He just had this gift for understanding what people needed to hear. The words that should have been comforting instead felt ominous. A gift for understanding what people needed to hear. Had Simon's entire relationship with me been built on his ability to say exactly what I wanted to hear? Had he done the same with Carrie? I remember when Simon called to tell me he was getting married, Damian continued. He was absolutely over the moon, said he'd found his soulmate, the woman he wanted to spend the rest of his life with. My chest tightened. When had that phone call taken place? When Simon married Carrie 12 years ago? Or when he married me 8 years ago? Or had Damian received multiple such calls without realizing they were about different women? The most unsettling moment came when Reverend Wellington invited attendees to share brief memories of Simon. Several people spoke, neighbors praising his helpfulness, colleagues noting his professionalism, friends recounting shared experiences. But then an older woman I didn't recognize stood up from the back of the chapel. "I'm Esther Kress," she said, her voice wavering slightly with age. "I was Simon's neighbor for the past 5 years. I wanted to say how much my husband Joe and I appreciated watching him with his children. He was such a devoted father, always outside teaching that boy how to throw a football, always patient when the little girl wanted to help him garden." The chapel fell silent except for the soft sound of Carrie's muffled crying. Esther was clearly talking about Henry and Louisa, describing scenes of domestic life that I had never witnessed, while I had known Simon as a man who claimed he wasn't sure about having children, who said he wanted to wait until our careers were more established. He had been living as a devoted father to 2 children I'd never known existed. "That boy has his father's arm for baseball," Esther continued, oblivious to the bombshell she was dropping. "And the little girl, she's going to be a beauty just like her mother. Simon used to joke that he'd need to buy a shotgun for when she started dating." I could feel eyes on me from various parts of the chapel, people who knew I had no children, who were trying to reconcile Esther's words with what they thought they knew about Simon's life. The careful compartmentalization of Simon's deception was beginning to crack in real time, in front of hundreds of witnesses. When Esther sat down, I noticed several whispered conversations starting throughout the chapel. People were confused, trying to make sense of what they'd heard. Some were looking at me with questioning expressions. Others were craning their necks to see who else might be in the audience that they didn't recognize. The service concluded with a hymn that Simon had apparently requested in his will, "Amazing Grace," sung by the church choir. As the music filled the chapel, I found myself thinking about the phrase, "was blind, but now I see." How appropriate, given that I was only now beginning to see the truth about the man I thought I'd known completely. As people began filing out toward the cemetery for the burial, I felt a gentle touch on my arm. It was Carrie, with Henry and Louisa beside her. "The woman who spoke about the children," she whispered urgently. "Mrs. Cress. She was talking about us, about our house. She lives 2 doors down from us." "I figured as much," I replied quietly, acutely aware that people were watching our interaction with curiosity. "Samantha," Carrie said, her voice barely audible, "if people start asking questions, if they start putting pieces together, we'll deal with it," I assured her, my legal training helping me maintain composure even as my personal world continued to collapse. But first, we need to understand exactly what we're dealing with. The burial is next, then there's a reception at my house. After that, we need to sit down and go through everything: documents, financial records, anything that might help us understand what Simon was really doing. Little did either of us know that the reception at my house would provide the next devastating revelation in Simon's carefully constructed web of lies. The reception at my Beacon Hill townhouse felt like hosting a wake for a stranger. I moved through my own home, the home I had shared with Simon for 8 years, feeling disconnected from everything around me. The caterers I'd hired bustled efficiently through the kitchen and dining room, serving finger foods and coffee to the steady stream of mourners who had followed us back from the cemetery. Carrie had agreed to come, though she'd hesitated when I first extended the invitation. "Are you sure that's appropriate?" she'd asked quietly as we stood beside Simon's grave. "People will start asking questions." "Let them ask," I'd replied. "We need answers, and this might be our best chance to get them." Now, watching Carrie navigate my living room with Henry and Louisa close by her side, I wondered if I'd made the right choice. My neighbors kept glancing between us with barely concealed curiosity, clearly trying to understand why a woman they'd never seen before was at my husband's funeral reception with 2 children who looked remarkably like Simon. The conversation that changed everything happened about 30 minutes into the reception. I was in the kitchen, checking with the caterers, when I overheard Jeff Wellington, Simon's golf partner from the country club, talking to James Cress from the investment firm. "I still can't believe Simon's gone," Jeff was saying, his voice carrying the slight slur of someone who'd had more than one drink. Just last month at the club, he was talking about finally taking that family vacation to Disney World he'd been promising the kids for years. James looked puzzled. "Kids? What kids? Simon and Samantha don't have children." "Sure they do," Jeff insisted. "Boy and a girl. Simon was always showing me pictures on his phone, bragging about the boys' baseball skills and the girls' dance performances." I felt the coffee cup slip from my hands but somehow managed to catch it before it shattered. Moving closer to the kitchen doorway, I positioned myself where I could hear clearly without being seen. "Jeff, I think you might be confused," James said gently. "Simon never mentioned children to anyone at the office." No, I'm telling you," Jeff persisted. "He had pictures, recent pictures. The kids were wearing school uniforms from that fancy private school over in Cambridge. St. Margaret's, I think." My blood ran cold. St. Margaret's Academy was indeed an expensive private school in Cambridge, exactly where Simon would want to send his children if money was no object. "And another thing," Jeff continued. Simon was always complaining about those private school tuitions, said it was costing him nearly $20,000 a year per kid, but it was worth it for the quality of education. When both men noticed me in the doorway, they fell silent immediately. James had the grace to look embarrassed, while Jeff simply looked confused. "Jeff," I said quietly, "those pictures Simon showed you of his children. Do you remember what they looked like?" "Well, the boy looked to be maybe 10 or 11, dark hair, kind of serious expression. The girl was younger, maybe 7 or 8, curly hair, big smile. Both of them definitely had Simon's eyes. Henry and Louisa." He was describing Henry and Louisa with perfect accuracy. After the last mourner left my townhouse, Carrie and I found ourselves alone with Henry and Louisa in my living room. The children had been remarkably well behaved throughout the afternoon, but I could see they were exhausted from the emotional strain. "They should probably get some rest," I suggested, watching Louisa lean heavily against her mother's shoulder while Henry stared blankly at the family photos on my mantel, photos that conspicuously featured only Simon and me. "We should go," Carrie agreed, but her voice lacked conviction. "This has been overwhelming." "Actually," I said, "I have guest rooms upstairs. Why don't you stay here tonight? We have a lot to figure out, and I think we'll both think more clearly after some sleep." An hour later, after I'd helped get Henry and Louisa settled in the larger guest room, Carrie and I sat in my study with cups of tea and the weight of impossible questions between us. "I keep thinking this is all a nightmare," Carrie said, staring into her cup. "That I'm going to wake up tomorrow and Simon will be making breakfast for the kids." "I know the feeling," I admitted. "But we need to start dealing with reality. And the reality is that we need to understand what Simon was really doing, financially and legally." I pulled out a leather portfolio from my desk, the one where I kept all our important documents: marriage certificate, insurance policies, property deeds, investment account statements, the paperwork of a life I'd thought I understood completely. "Let's start with the basics," I said, spreading documents across my coffee table. "This is our marriage certificate from 8 years ago. These are our joint bank account statements and investment portfolios." Carrie pulled similar documents from her purse. "Here are ours: marriage certificate from 12 years ago, property deed for our house in Cambridge, bank statements, investment accounts. And these are the children's birth certificates, school, enrollment forms, and medical records." We spent the next hour comparing documents, and the picture that emerged was both fascinating and terrifying in its complexity. According to our respective paperwork, Simon had somehow managed to maintain completely separate financial lives while accumulating assets under both identities. "Look at this," I said, pointing to an investment account statement. "This shows a balance of $400,000 as of last month, but the account number is different from any of yours." "Same here," Carrie replied. "This shows $300,000 in a retirement account that I didn't know existed. And look at these automatic deposits. They're much larger than what Simon ever told me he was earning." The discrepancies were staggering. Between our two sets of documents, Simon appeared to have accumulated well over $1 million in assets, far more than either of us had realized. Every major deposit into these accounts corresponds with dates when Simon told me he was traveling for work, I observed, cross-referencing dates with my calendar. "And every withdrawal corresponds with times when he told me he needed to make emergency business investments," Carrie added. "He was always asking me to sign papers without reading them carefully, saying they were just routine business filings." I felt my stomach drop as I realized what we were looking at. "Carrie, I think Simon may have been using both of our signatures to authorize financial transactions without our knowledge. These aren't just separate accounts. They're accounts that required both wives' authorization to access fully." Monday morning arrived with gray, drizzling rain that seemed to match the darkness of our situation. I had barely slept, spending most of the night reviewing documents and making notes about discrepancies in Simon's financial records. Carrie had been equally restless. I'd heard her moving around the guest room throughout the night. I had called Marcus Whitmore, one of Boston's top criminal defense attorneys, at 6 in the morning. Marcus and I had worked together on several cases where estate planning intersected with criminal matters, and I trusted his judgment completely. "Samantha," he'd said when I explained the situation, "if your husband was running investment fraud, schemes and using joint accounts that required your authorization, you're potentially looking at federal conspiracy charges. We need to be very careful about how we handle this." Now, sitting in my firm's conference room with Marcus across from me and Agent Sarah Kress from the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit taking notes, I felt like I was living in someone else's nightmare. "Mrs. Fraser," Agent Kress began, "we've been investigating a sophisticated investment fraud operation, and your husband's name has come up repeatedly in our inquiries." She slid a folder across the table. "We'd like you to look at these documents and tell us if you recognize any of the signatures or account numbers." I opened the folder and felt my world tilt further off its axis. Inside were photocopies of investment contracts, bank transfer authorizations, and business incorporation documents, all bearing my signature alongside Simon's. But these weren't documents I remembered signing. "These signatures appear to be mine," I admitted, studying the handwriting carefully. "But I don't recall signing any of these specific documents." "According to our investigation," Agent Kress continued, "these documents authorize the transfer of approximately $2.8 million from various investors into accounts controlled by your husband." Marcus leaned forward. "Agent Kress, my client is an estate planning attorney with an impeccable professional reputation. If she says she doesn't remember signing these documents, then we need to explore the circumstances under which her signature was obtained." The memory hit me like a physical blow. How many times had Simon brought me stacks of papers to sign while I was working late or preparing for court? "Just some routine investment updates," he'd say, "or tax documentation that needs to be filed by tomorrow." "Yes," I admitted reluctantly. "Simon often brought me papers to sign. He said they were routine business matters, that as his wife I needed to be listed on various accounts for tax purposes. Did you ever read the documents before signing them?" "Not carefully. I trusted my husband. He was an investment professional, and he said the paperwork was just regulatory compliance." Agent Kress made notes in her file. "Mrs. Fraser, are you aware that your husband was married to another woman? That he had children you didn't know about?" "I became aware of that situation at his funeral," I replied carefully. "Another woman approached me claiming to be his wife, with 2 children. We'll be speaking with her next. According to our records, she also signed similar documents, apparently under similar circumstances." Agent Kress closed her folder. "Mrs. Fraser, we're going to need you to provide us with complete financial records for all accounts you shared with your husband, and I need to advise you that you should not discuss this investigation with anyone outside your legal counsel." After Agent Kress left, Marcus and I sat in silence for several minutes. "How bad is this?" I asked finally. "Potentially very bad," he admitted. "But the fact that you and the other wife were both apparently deceived in the same way works in your favor. It suggests a pattern of manipulation rather than willing participation in fraud." When I returned home from the FBI meeting, I found Carrie in my kitchen making lunch for Henry and Louisa. The scene was so domestic, so normal, that for a moment I could almost forget the chaos that had engulfed our lives. The children were sitting at my breakfast bar, quietly eating sandwiches and coloring in notebooks Carrie must have brought from their house. "How did it go?" Carrie asked, her voice carefully neutral in front of the children, but her eyes betraying her anxiety. "We need to talk," I replied, glancing meaningfully toward Henry and Louisa. "After lunch." "Kids," Carrie said gently, "why don't you go explore the backyard after you finish eating? Mrs. Fraser has a beautiful garden." Once the children were outside, visible through the kitchen window but out of earshot, I told Carrie everything. The investment fraud, the 47 victims, the $5 million in stolen money, and our potential involvement as unwitting co-conspirators. I watched her face grow pale as I described the documents with our signatures authorizing transfers we'd never knowingly approved. "Oh, God," she whispered, sinking into one of my kitchen chairs. "I signed so many papers. Simon was always bringing me things to sign, saying they were just routine business documents or tax filings. I never questioned him, because I trusted him completely." "The FBI wants to interview you next," I continued. "Agent Kress made it clear that we're both persons of interest in their investigation." Carrie was quiet for a long moment, staring out at her children playing in my garden. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "Samantha, there's something I haven't told you. Something I found in Simon's papers when I was gathering documents for the funeral." She reached into her purse and pulled out a manila envelope that looked like it had been handled repeatedly. "I found this hidden in his home office, taped under one of the desk drawers. I almost didn't mention it because it seemed too personal, too private. But now," she handed me the envelope. My name was written on it in Simon's distinctive handwriting, along with a date from just 3 weeks ago. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a small key. The letter was brief but devastating. "Samantha, if you're reading this, then something has happened to me, and you've discovered the truth about Carrie and the children. I know you'll hate me for the deceptions, but please understand that I never meant for any of this to hurt you. What started as a mistake became a life I couldn't abandon, but I also couldn't give up the life I built with you. The key opens a safety deposit box at First National Bank, box number 1247. Inside, you'll find documents that explain everything: the real business I've been involved in, the money I've earned, and the arrangements I've made for everyone's future. You're the only person I trust to handle this properly. I've made terrible choices, but I've also made provisions. You'll understand when you see what's in the box. Please take care of Carrie and the children. They don't deserve to suffer for my mistakes. I'm sorry for everything. Simon." I read the letter twice, my hands shaking. "He knew," I said finally. Somehow he knew this was all going to come out. "There's more," Carrie said quietly. She pulled out another document from the envelope, a photocopy of what appeared to be a life insurance policy. "This is a copy of a life insurance policy I'd never seen before. It's for $2 million, and it lists both of us as beneficiaries. Equal shares." I stared at the policy document. The premium payments were substantial, over $8,000 per month. Far more than what our household budget could have supported based on Simon's declared income. Where was he getting the money to pay these premiums? I asked, though I was beginning to suspect I knew the answer. "That's not all," Carrie continued. "Look at the date this policy was taken out. It was just 6 months ago, right around the time Simon started acting strange." "Strange how?" "More secretive than usual, more stressed. He started asking me a lot of questions about what I would do if something happened to him, whether I felt confident managing finances on my own. At the time, I thought he was just being responsible, planning for the future." I studied the policy more carefully. The medical exam had been waived, which was unusual for such a large policy, and the beneficiary designation specifically stated that the proceeds would be paid regardless of the circumstances of death. Simon had clearly been planning for a contingency that went beyond normal financial planning. "We need to get to that safety deposit box," I said. "Today." An hour later, we stood in the sterile vault area of First National Bank while a bank employee verified our identification and Simon's death certificate. The key Carrie had found fit perfectly, and inside the narrow metal box was a treasure trove of documents that began to answer our questions while raising dozens of new ones. The first document was a detailed confession, written in Simon's handwriting, and dated just 2 weeks before his death. In it, he admitted to running a sophisticated Ponzi scheme that had been operating for over 6 years. He described how he'd used his legitimate investment business as a front while promising investors unrealistic returns, and using new investor money to pay earlier investors. He knew it was collapsing, I said, reading through the confession. Listen to this. The scheme has become unsustainable. I estimate I need $12 million in new investments just to meet this quarter's promised returns. But new investor interest has dried up. It's only a matter of time before someone asks for a full redemption I can't honor. But the most shocking revelation was in the second document. A detailed breakdown of how Simon had used both of our signatures to legitimize his operations. He'd created fake investment partnerships that required spousal authorization, then used our signatures on what we thought were routine paperwork to authorize the fraudulent transactions. We weren't just unwitting accomplices, I realized, feeling sick. We were essential to his scheme. He needed married women with good reputations to make his fake investment partnerships look legitimate. The final document in the box was a letter addressed to both of us. Samantha and Carrie, I know that finding out about each other will be devastating, but I hope you'll understand that you both gave me something I needed desperately: legitimacy and love. My business required the appearance of stability that marriage provided, but somewhere along the way, both relationships became real to me. The life insurance money is clean. It comes from a legitimate policy I paid for with money I earned before. The fraud began. It's my way of ensuring that you and the children will be financially secure even after the government seizes everything else. I've documented everything about the fraud scheme in these papers. Use this information to cooperate with federal investigators and to help the victims recover what they can. You both deserve better than the legacy I'm leaving you. Simon. As we drove home with the documents, Carrie and I were both quiet, processing the magnitude of what we'd discovered. Simon hadn't just been living a double life. He'd been using both of our lives as components in an elaborate criminal enterprise. The question now, I said finally, is whether we can use this information to protect ourselves and help the victims, or whether we're already too deep in this mess to avoid serious legal consequences. What neither of us realized yet was that Simon's confession would reveal an even more shocking truth about why he'd really chosen us as his wives, and what that meant for our futures. The next morning, I called Marcus Whitmore and arranged for him to meet both Carrie and me at my law firm. The documents from Simon's safety deposit box were spread across my conference table like pieces of an intricate puzzle, each one revealing another layer of calculation behind what we'd thought were genuine relationships. This changes everything, Marcus said after reviewing Simon's confession. The fact that he documented his own crimes and explicitly stated that you were both unknowing participants gives us significant leverage with federal prosecutors. But it was the third document in the safety deposit box, one we'd only glanced at the day before, that revealed the most disturbing truth about Simon's selection of wives. It was a handwritten analysis, almost clinical in its detailing, titled Partnership Assessment. Marcus read it aloud. Samantha Wellington, estate planning attorney, impeccable reputation, extensive knowledge of financial regulations, social. Connections in Boston legal community provide credibility for investment partnerships. Signature carries significant legal weight due to professional standing. I felt nauseous hearing my qualifications listed like items in a business plan. Carrie Morrison, graphic design background, experience with marketing materials and document layout. Artistic skills useful for creating professional-looking investment. Brochures and promotional materials. Part-time work schedule allows for flexibility in travel and meeting attendance. Carrie's face had gone pale. He married us for our skills, she said quietly. I wasn't a wife. I was a business asset. Marcus continued reading. Both women demonstrate high trust levels and minimal interest in financial details outside. Their professional, personal expertise. Samantha's legal background provides legitimacy, but also creates tunnel vision. She focuses on estate planning technicalities rather than investment operations. Carrie's artistic nature means she trusts emotional appeals over financial analysis. The clinical assessment of our personalities was devastating. Simon had studied us like a predator studies prey, identifying exactly which emotional buttons to push and which professional blind spots to exploit. "There's more," Marcus said grimly. He turned to a page that made my blood run cold. Long-term strategy. Maintain separate households to ensure wives cannot compare financial information or discover discrepancies in reported income business activities. Use Samantha's legal signature for high-value transactions requiring attorney verification. Use Carrie's design skills for investor materials and her maternal responsibilities to explain frequent absences. "He planned the children," Carrie whispered, her voice breaking. Henry and Louisa weren't accidents or expressions of love. They were strategic decisions to keep me tied to him and explain why he couldn't be home more often. I reached across the table and took her hand, feeling the tremor in her fingers. "The children are innocent in this, Carrie. Whatever Simon's motivations were, Henry and Louisa are real, and your love for them is real." But Marcus had found something else, a section that made everything even more calculated. Financial projections. Samantha's professional income provides legitimate funding source for premium lifestyle expenses, reducing suspicion about source of wealth. Carrie's lower income creates dependency, ensuring loyalty and reducing likelihood of independent financial investigation. Combined household management allows for sophisticated money laundering through legitimate family expenses. He was using our normal family expenses to hide stolen money, I realized. The mortgage payments, the children's school tuition, even our grocery bills, it was all part of laundering the fraud proceeds. Marcus set down the document and looked at both of us seriously. "Here's what this means legally. Simon's own documentation proves that he specifically chose you both for your professional skills and personal characteristics that would make you useful to his criminal enterprise while keeping you ignorant of it. This is textbook predatory manipulation." "Will that protect us from prosecution?" Carrie asked. "It should, but we need to be strategic about how we present this to the FBI." Marcus gathered the papers into neat stacks. "The good news is that Simon essentially provided a roadmap for your defense. The bad news is that he also documented exactly how his scheme worked, which means federal prosecutors now have everything they need to pursue criminal charges against his associates." "Associates?" I asked. "You mean there were other people involved?" Marcus nodded grimly and pointed to a section I'd missed. "According to this, Simon was part of a larger network. He mentions coordination with at least 4 other individuals, running similar schemes in different cities. The FBI investigation is probably much larger than Agent Kress let on." That afternoon, we met again with Agent Kress, this time with Marcus present and armed with Simon's complete confession. The FBI agent's demeanor changed noticeably when she saw the documentation. "This is extraordinary," she admitted after reviewing the safety deposit box contents. "In 20 years of investigating financial crimes, I've never seen a perpetrator document his own manipulation tactics this thoroughly." "What does this mean for my clients?" Marcus asked. "It means they're clearly victims rather than conspirators," Agent Kress replied. "But it also means they're going to be crucial witnesses in a much larger investigation. The network Simon describes has been on our radar for 2 years. This documentation could help us shut down the entire operation." "What about the other wives?" Carrie asked suddenly. "If Simon was part of a network, and if he chose us specifically for our professional skills, then the other men probably did the same thing. There could be other women out there who don't even know their husbands are criminals." Agent Kress exchanged a meaningful look with her partner, Agent Joe Whitmore, who had joined us for this meeting. "That's actually very insightful, Mrs. Wellington. We've identified several cases with similar patterns. Professional women, married to investment advisors who were running fraud schemes." "How many women?" I asked. 7 that we know of so far. 2 attorneys, 1 accountant, 1 graphic designer, 1 marketing executive, 1 real estate developer, and 1 bank manager. All of them married to men who were part of this investment fraud network. The scope of the manipulation was staggering. 7 women, carefully selected for their professional skills and personal vulnerabilities, all unknowingly serving as cover for a sophisticated criminal enterprise. Agent Kress, I said, my legal mind beginning to see possibilities. What if we could help you contact these other women? What if we could provide them with the same information we found, show them Simon's documentation about how these schemes work? That's an interesting proposition, Mrs. Fraser. What exactly are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that 7 professional women who've been systematically manipulated and used might be very motivated to help you shut down the people who did this to them. And we might be uniquely positioned to help them understand what happened and what they need to do to protect themselves. Carrie looked at me with something that might have been hope for the first time since Simon's funeral. You mean we could help other women avoid what we're going through? More than that, I replied, an idea forming. We could help them fight back. 2 weeks later, I found myself sitting in a conference room at the FBI field office with 6 other women who had lived through variations of the same nightmare that Carrie and I were experiencing. Agent Kress had arranged what she called a victim coordination meeting, but it felt more like a support group for the systematically deceived. The women around the table represented different cities, different professions, but remarkably similar stories. There was Esther Kress, a bank manager from Hartford whose husband had used her position to legitimize fake business accounts. Louisa Wellington, a real estate developer from Providence, whose signature had authorized property transfers she'd never known about. Claude Fraser, a marketing executive from Burlington whose creative skills had been used to design fraudulent investment materials. Each woman had brought documentation similar to what Carrie and I had found. Safety deposit box contents, hidden confessions, detailed analyses of why they'd been chosen as wives. The pattern was so consistent it was almost like reading the same playbook executed 7 different times. My husband rated my compliance level and professional value, like, I was a piece of equipment, said Esther, her voice tight with controlled anger as she read from her deceased husband's notes. He wrote that my banking background made me ideal for legitimizing complex financial structures, and that my trusting nature and focus on family responsibilities made me unlikely to ask detailed questions about business operations. Claude held up a portfolio of marketing materials she'd apparently designed without realizing their true purpose. I created all of these, she said, spreading glossy brochures across the table. Professional investment fund prospectuses, client newsletters, promotional materials. He told me they were for legitimate clients, that he was proud to have such talented work representing his business. The marketing materials were sophisticated, exactly the kind of professional presentation that would convince potential victims to invest their life savings. Claude's artistic skills had been weaponized against innocent retirees and families without her knowledge. The children, said Louisa Wellington quietly. She was the only other woman besides Carrie who had children with her deceased husband. My husband documented that having children served multiple strategic purposes. It provided cover for frequent absences, created financial needs that justified aggressive investment strategies, and ensured my emotional dependency on the relationship. Carrie reached across the table and squeezed Louisa's hand. How old are yours? 9 and 6, a boy and a girl, just like yours. Louisa's voice broke slightly. I keep wondering if he ever loved them, or if they were just strategic decisions. Agent Kress had been quietly taking notes throughout our discussions. Ladies, what you're describing is one of the most sophisticated manipulation schemes we've encountered. These men didn't just choose wives, they recruited professional accomplices through romantic manipulation. What's the legal status of our situations? Asked Esther. Are we all facing potential prosecution? Based on the documentation you've provided, We're confident that all of you were victims rather than willing participants, Agent Kress replied. However, we're going to need your cooperation to help us understand the full scope of the network and to assist with prosecution of any surviving associates. That phrase, surviving associates, hung in the air ominously. Of the 7 husbands involved in the network, 5 had died within the past 18 months. Only 2 were still alive, and both had disappeared shortly before their schemes collapsed. Agent Kress, I said, the timing of these deaths seems suspicious. 5 husbands dead, 2 missing, all within the same time frame that their fraud schemes were collapsing. We've noticed that pattern as well, Mrs. Fraser. We're investigating whether these deaths were truly accidental or if there was some kind of coordination within the network. The implications were chilling. Had the men planned their own deaths to avoid prosecution? Had they been eliminated by other members of the network to prevent them from cooperating with authorities? Or was there some other explanation for the convenient timing of their demises? There's something else, Agent Kress continued. The life insurance policies. All 7 of your husbands took out substantial life insurance policies within 6 months of their deaths, all with similar terms and beneficiary structures. She spread copies of insurance documents across the table. Each policy was for between $1 and $3 million, all taken out with different insurance companies, but all requiring minimal medical examinations and all structured to pay out, regardless of the cause of death. $14 million in total life insurance payouts, I calculated, studying the documents. That's more than twice the amount of money they stole from victims. Which raises the question, Agent Kress said, of whether the insurance policies were part of the exit strategy for the fraud scheme, or whether someone else orchestrated these deaths to collect the insurance money. Claude looked up from the documents with a puzzled expression. My husband's policy lists me as the primary beneficiary, but there's a secondary beneficiary I don't recognize. Damien Associates Trust. Who or what is that? I felt a chill run down my spine. Simon mentioned someone named Damien in his college stories. Said he was his roommate, but I never met him. Damien Whitmore spoke at Simon's funeral, Carrie added. He flew in from California and gave a very emotional eulogy about their friendship. Agent Kress and her partner exchanged meaningful looks. Ladies, we need you to tell us everything you remember about anyone named Damien who was connected to your husbands. Phone calls, visits, business meetings, casual mentions, anything. As we began piecing together our memories, a disturbing picture emerged. Each of us could remember our husbands mentioning someone named Damien, sometimes as a college friend, sometimes as a business associate, sometimes as a financial advisor. But none of us had ever met him in person, and our husbands had always been vague about the specifics of their relationship with him. He was like a ghost, Esther said. Always present in the background of my husband's business conversations, but never actually visible. I think, I said slowly, we may have found the person who was really running this network. And if he's listed as a secondary beneficiary on all these life insurance policies, then he had a $14 million motive to make sure our husbands didn't live to testify against him. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. We weren't just victims of fraud. We might be widows because someone had systematically eliminated the men who could expose him. But we were also 7 professional women with complementary skills and a powerful motivation for justice. And unlike our deceased husbands, we were very much alive and increasingly determined to fight back. The FBI assigned Agent Joe Fraser to coordinate our investigation into Damien Whitmore, and within 48 hours, we had assembled in a secure conference room that looked more like a war room than a meeting space. The walls were covered with timeline charts, financial flow diagrams, and photographs of our deceased husbands alongside documentation of their crimes. Damien Whitmore is a ghost, Agent Fraser announced, pinning a nearly blank profile sheet to the center wall. No current address, no active bank accounts, No employment records for the past 3 years. But he's been very busy behind the scenes. The agent spread out financial records that traced money movements between our husband's fraudulent schemes and a series of shell companies registered to various iterations of Damien's name. The pattern was sophisticated. Money would flow from victim investments into our husband's accounts, then move through multiple transfers before landing in accounts controlled by Damien's entities. He was taking a percentage from each scheme, I realized, studying the financial flows. Not just coordinating the network, but profiting from every transaction. 30%, Agent Fraser confirmed, of the total $5 million stolen. From victims across all 7 schemes, Damien's companies received approximately $1.5 million. Carrie looked up from the documents she'd been reviewing. But that's not the only money he stood to gain. If he's listed as secondary beneficiary on all the life insurance policies, $14 million, Esther finished. Much more than his share of the fraud proceeds. Agent Fraser nodded grimly, which gives him substantial financial motivation to ensure your husbands couldn't testify against him. But here's what's particularly disturbing: the timing of the insurance policy applications. He displayed a timeline that made our collective situation even more sinister. Each of our husbands had applied for life insurance within weeks of each other, despite living in different cities and supposedly operating independent schemes. They were coordinated, Claude said, her marketing background helping her spot the pattern. Someone told them all to get life insurance at the same time. Someone who knew what was coming. We believe Damien convinced your husbands to take out these policies as part of an exit strategy, Agent Fraser explained. He probably told them the insurance money would provide financial security for their families after they disappeared or faced prosecution. But instead of an exit strategy, it was a termination plan, I said, the legal implications becoming clear. He was planning to kill them all along. The room fell silent as we processed this possibility. Our husbands hadn't just been criminals, they'd been marked for death by someone they trusted. Agent Fraser, Louisa asked quietly, how did they die? I mean, what were the official causes of death? The agent consulted his files. Simon Fraser, apparent heart attack during a business trip. Michael Wellington, car accident on a rural highway. Thomas Kress, accidental drowning during a fishing trip. James Morrison, apparent suicide by overdose. Robert Chen, home invasion robbery gone wrong. All different methods, I observed. All appearing accidental or explainable. Very convenient for someone who needed them dead but didn't want. To raise suspicions. What about the 2 who are still alive? Carrie asked. David Thompson and Mark Rodriguez both disappeared within days of each other, about 2 weeks before the first death. We believe they may have discovered Damien's plan and fled before he could implement it. Agent Fraser pulled out 2 more photographs and pinned them to the wall. We've been searching for Thompson and Rodriguez for 8 months. If they're still alive, they're the only people who can directly testify about Damien's involvement in the network. I studied the photographs of the eye. 2 missing men, trying to see if there were any clues in their faces about what they might have known. Agent Fraser, have you considered that Thompson and Rodriguez might not be hiding from law enforcement? They might be hiding from Damien. That's our working theory, which is why we need your help. Our help? You 7 women represent the most comprehensive source of information about this network that we have. You lived with these men, signed documents, heard phone conversations, saw visitors. You may have observed details that could help us track down either Damien or the missing men. Agent Fraser turned to address all of us. We're proposing something unprecedented. We want you to work with us as civilian consultants, helping us analyze the evidence and potentially making contact with Thompson and Rodriguez if we can locate them. Is that legal? Asked Esther, her banking background making her cautious about regulatory compliance. Completely legal and potentially very effective. Your unique perspective as victims who were also inadvertent insiders could be invaluable. Carrie raised her hand tentatively. What about our children? Henry and Louisa don't know anything about their father's crimes yet, and Louisa's children are in the same situation. If we're working on an active FBI investigation, we'll provide security measures for all family members, Agent Fraser assured her. But I need to be clear about the risks. If Damien realizes you're actively working against him, you could become targets. The room was quiet for several minutes as we each considered the implications. We were being asked to potentially put ourselves in danger to pursue justice for crimes we'd been unknowing accomplices to. I want to do it, I said finally. Simon destroyed 47 families with his fraud. If there's a chance we can prevent Damien from doing the same thing to other women, other families, then I think we have an obligation to try. One by one, the other women agreed. We'd been chosen as wives for our professional skills and personal characteristics. Now we were going to use those same qualities to bring down the man who had orchestrated our manipulation. There's one more thing, Agent Fraser said as we prepared to leave. We have reason to believe Damien may already be establishing new relationships, possibly looking for his next group of professional wives, which means time is not on our side. The hunt for Damien Whitmore was about to begin, and 7 vengeful widows were going to help the FBI track him down. The FBI set up our task force in a secure facility outside Boston, complete with encrypted communication systems and round-the-clock security. They'd given us an official designation, Civilian Advisory Task Force for Financial Network Crimes, but among ourselves, we'd started calling it the Widow's Revenge Squad. Each of us brought different professional expertise to the investigation. I handled the legal analysis. Carrie managed document organization and visual presentation of evidence. Esther tracked financial movements through banking systems, and Claude created psychological profiles based on her marketing background. It felt strange using the same skills our husbands had manipulated for criminal purposes to now bring down their coordinator. We've had a breakthrough, Agent Fraser announced during our 3rd week of operations. He pinned a new set of photographs to our evidence wall. We found David Thompson. The photographs showed a thin, nervous-looking man in his early 40s sitting across from FBI agents in what appeared to be a safe house interview room. Thompson looked haunted, like someone who'd been running scared for months. Where was he? Asked Louisa. Living under an assumed name in a fishing village in Maine. Apparently, he'd been working as a boat mechanic, paying cash for everything, completely off the grid. Agent Fraser pulled out a thick transcript. His testimony confirms everything we suspected about Damien's operation. According to Thompson's statement, Damien Whitmore had been recruiting men with investment backgrounds for over 8 years, teaching them how to run sophisticated Ponzi schemes while providing them with detailed profiles of potential wives who could serve as unknowing accomplices. Listen to this, Agent Fraser read from the transcript. Damien had files on hundreds of professional women, attorneys, accountants, marketing executives, bank managers, anyone whose career credentials could legitimize fraudulent investment. Operations. He would identify women going through life transitions, divorce, career changes, family deaths, times when they might be emotionally vulnerable to romantic manipulation. The systematic nature of the targeting was chilling. Damien hadn't just been running financial fraud. He'd been operating what amounted to a romance scam factory, training men to identify and manipulate specific types of professional women. Thompson says Damien called it professional matchmaking. Agent Fraser continued. He'd match each man with a woman whose skills complemented the specific type of fraud they were planning to run. What about the life insurance policies? I asked, dreading the answer. Thompson confirms our suspicions. Damien convinced all the men to take out large policies about 18 months ago, telling them it was insurance against getting caught. He said if they were arrested or their schemes collapsed, the insurance money would ensure their families were financially secure. But really, he was planning to collect on all the policies himself, Carrie said. Exactly. Thompson says Damien had told them he was developing an exit strategy that would allow them all to disappear with clean identities and new lives. Instead, He was planning to eliminate them and collect $14 million in insurance proceeds. Esther leaned forward, her banking expertise engaged. How was he planning to access the insurance money if he was only listed as secondary beneficiary? Agent Fraser's expression grew darker. According to Thompson, Damien had contingency plans for each wife. He'd been monitoring all of you, gathering information about your daily routines, professional schedules, family situations. Thompson believes Damien was planning to eliminate the wives as well, making the deaths look like murder-suicides or family tragedies. The room went completely silent. We'd known we were victims of fraud and manipulation, but the realization that we'd all been marked for death was almost too overwhelming to process. Thompson escaped because he overheard a phone conversation. Agent Fraser continued. Damien was talking to someone about finalizing the insurance collection protocol and mentioned specific details about how each family would be eliminated. Each family, Claude repeated quietly, including the children. Including the children, Agent Fraser confirmed. Thompson says that's when he realized Damien wasn't planning an exit strategy. He was planning a mass murder disguised as a series of unrelated family tragedies. I felt nauseous thinking about Henry and Louisa, about how close we'd all come to a fate we'd never even suspected. Agent Fraser, you said Thompson escaped. What about Rodriguez? Thompson doesn't know. Rodriguez disappeared the same night, but they fled in different directions. Rodriguez hasn't been found yet. Alive or dead? Asked Carrie. Unknown. But Thompson believes Rodriguez might have had more specific information about Damien's current location and future plans. Agent Fraser pulled out a map marked with red pins showing the locations of each family in Damien's network. Here's what we know from Thompson's testimony. Damien has been systematically working his way through a target list. 5 families eliminated. 2 escaped, and according to Thompson, there are at least 3 more professional women who may already be unknowingly married to men in Damien's new network. The implications hit us all simultaneously. Somewhere, 3 more women like us were living with men who were planning to defraud investors, steal their signatures for criminal enterprises, and ultimately murder them and their children for insurance. Money. We have to find them, I said, my legal instincts kicking in. We have to warn them before it's too late. That's exactly what we're planning to do, Agent Fraser replied. Thompson provided us with partial information about the new targets, but it's incomplete. We need your help to fill in the gaps. He spread out 3 partial profiles across the table. Fragments of information about professional women who fit Damien's targeting criteria. Each profile contained just enough detail to be tantalizing. A corporate attorney in Chicago, a marketing director in Seattle, a bank vice president in Atlanta. Thompson heard Damien mention these women in phone conversations, but he doesn't have their names or specific locations. We need you to help us figure out who they are and how to reach them before Damien's timeline advances. Looking at those incomplete profiles, I realized that any one of them could have been me 2 years ago. Successful, trusting, vulnerable in ways I hadn't even recognized. The only difference between us and them was timing and luck. How long do we have? Asked Carrie. Thompson thinks Damien is moving faster now, trying to complete his next phase before we can track him down. Based on the timeline for our husbands, these women could be in immediate danger. The race to save 3 strangers from our fate had begun. Working with FBI resources and our combined professional networks, we'd managed to narrow down the 3 potential victims within 48 hours. The corporate attorney in Chicago was Sarah Whitmore, a partner at a prestigious firm specializing in international business law. The marketing director in Seattle was Jennifer Kress, who ran campaigns for tech startups. The bank vice president in Atlanta was Michelle Fraser, who oversaw commercial lending for a major regional bank. The surnames weren't coincidental. Agent Joe Fraser confirmed that Damien had a pattern of targeting women whose professional reputations would be enhanced by association with his manufactured identities. He'd been using variations of our names as cover identities for years. "We have a problem," Agent Fraser announced during our morning briefing. "We can't just contact these women directly and tell them their husbands are criminals. If we're wrong about any of them, we could destroy innocent marriages. If we're right but move too quickly, we could alert Damien that we're closing in." "What about surveillance?" suggested Esther. "Watch their activities, look for patterns that match what our husbands were doing?" "We're already doing that. But surveillance takes time, and Thompson's timeline suggests Damien is moving toward his end game rapidly. I'd been studying the three women's professional profiles, looking for connections we might have missed. Agent Fraser, what if we approached this differently? What if we used our expertise to create a situation where these women would contact us?" "What do you mean?" "I mean we use our professional credentials to legitimate advantage for once. I could reach out to Sarah Whitmore about a complex estate planning case that requires international business law expertise. Carrie could contact Jennifer Kress about a marketing consultation. Esther could approach Michelle Fraser about a commercial lending opportunity. Professional networking," Claude added, understanding my strategy. "Create legitimate reasons for contact that wouldn't raise suspicions, but would give us opportunities to assess their situations." Agent Fraser considered this. "It could work, but you'd have to be extremely careful. If these women are married to Damien's associates, anything unusual could trigger defensive responses. Or," Carrie said quietly, "it could give them the opening they need to ask for help if they're already suspicious about their husband's activities." We spent the next 2 hours crafting our approach strategies. I would contact Sarah Whitmore about a fictional estate planning case involving international assets that required both estate law and business law expertise. Carrie would reach out to Jennifer Kress about developing marketing materials for a nonprofit organization, the Victim Advocacy Foundation we'd been discussing establishing. Esther would approach Michelle Fraser about financing options for the same nonprofit. The calls had to be carefully scripted to sound legitimate, while creating opportunities for the women to reveal information about their personal situations. We practiced our conversations repeatedly, with the other task force members playing the roles of the target women. "Remember," Agent Fraser warned us, "these women may be completely innocent and happily married, or they may be in immediate danger. Either way, your first priority is gathering information without alerting anyone to our investigation." I made the first call to Sarah Whitmore's office in Chicago. Her assistant scheduled a phone consultation for later that afternoon, mentioning that Mrs. Whitmore had been working unusual hours lately due to her husband's demanding travel schedule. Carrie's call to Jennifer Kress in Seattle went directly to voicemail. The outgoing message mentioned that Jennifer would be out of the office for several days due to a family emergency, but would return calls as soon as possible. Esther's attempt to reach Michelle Fraser in Atlanta was more revealing. The bank's receptionist explained that Mrs. Fraser had requested a leave of absence 2 weeks earlier due to personal circumstances, and they weren't sure when she'd be returning. 2 out of 3 women are suddenly unavailable or dealing with personal emergencies, I observed after we'd completed our initial contact attempts. That could be coincidental, or it could mean Damien's timeline is more advanced than we thought. Agent Fraser was already on his phone, speaking rapidly with agents in Chicago, Seattle, and Atlanta. When he hung up, his expression was grim. Local field offices are conducting immediate welfare checks on all 3 women. But there's something else. We just received word that Mark Rodriguez's body was found in a motel outside Denver. He'd been dead for approximately 2 weeks. The news hit us like a physical blow. Rodriguez had been our last hope for someone who could provide direct testimony about Damien's current plans. "Cause of death?" asked Claude. "Apparent drug overdose, but the circumstances are suspicious. Rodriguez had no history of drug use, and the motel room was registered under a false name. Damien's cleaning house," I realized. First our husbands, now Rodriguez. He's eliminating anyone who could testify against him. Which means, Carrie added, he knows we're closing in. Agent Fraser's phone buzzed with an urgent text. His face went pale as he read it. The welfare check in Chicago found Sarah Whitmore's house empty. Neighbors say she and her husband left suddenly 3 days ago with several suitcases. They told neighbors they were taking a second honeymoon to celebrate their anniversary. What about Seattle and Atlanta? Still waiting for reports, but... His phone buzzed again. Jennifer Kress in Seattle also appears to have left suddenly. Her office received a resignation letter by email, but when agents checked her apartment, it looked like she'd packed quickly and left most of her belongings behind. The pattern was terrifying. Either these women were fleeing with their husbands, or they were being taken somewhere against their will. Agent Fraser, I said, if Damien is moving this quickly, if he's taking these women somewhere, we need to consider the possibility that he's not planning to wait for the insurance money. He might be planning to eliminate everyone at once. A mass casualty event, Esther said, her voice barely above a whisper, which would allow him to disappear completely with whatever assets he's already accumulated, rather than waiting for insurance payouts that might take months to process. Agent Fraser was already coordinating with field offices across the country, but I could see the frustration in his expression. Damien had been planning this for years, and he was always one step ahead of our investigation. There's one more thing, Agent Fraser said grimly. The timing of Rodriguez's death and these women's disappearances corresponds with something Thompson mentioned in his testimony. Damien had talked about a final phase that would happen at a remote location where he could complete all outstanding business obligations. A kill site, Claude said bluntly. He's taking them somewhere isolated where he can murder everyone without witnesses. And we had no idea where that location might be. The break came from an unexpected source, Henry, Carrie's 11-year-old son. While the adults had been consumed with FBI briefings and criminal investigations, Henry had been quietly processing his father's death and the strange adults who kept asking his mother questions about Daddy's work friends. Mom, Henry said during dinner at the safe house where our families were staying, I remembered something about Uncle Damien. Carrie nearly dropped her fork. We'd been careful not to mention Damien's name around the children, but apparently, Henry had been listening more carefully than we'd realized. What do you remember, sweetheart? Carrie asked gently, while Agent Fraser quietly activated a recording device. Last summer, when Uncle Damien called to talk to Daddy about the cabin, Daddy was excited because Uncle Damien said we could all go there for a vacation when his business deals were finished. What cabin? I asked, trying to keep my voice casual despite the adrenaline rushing through my system. The one with the lake. Uncle Damien said it was way up in the mountains where nobody could bother them with work calls. Daddy said it sounded perfect for a family retreat. Agent Fraser leaned forward slightly. Henry, did your dad mention where this cabin was? What state or what mountains? Henry scrunched his face in concentration. I think New Hampshire? Or maybe Vermont? Somewhere with lots of trees and a big lake. Uncle Damien said it was on an island so they'd have complete privacy. An island, Agent Fraser repeated, making notes. Did your father mention anything else about this place? Just that Uncle Damien owned it through his company, and that it was really expensive to get to because you had to take a special boat or a helicopter. Within an hour, FBI analysts were cross-referencing property records in New Hampshire and Vermont for any remote lake properties connected to Damien Whitmore or his known shell companies. The search parameters included private islands, expensive access requirements, and properties suitable for hosting multiple families. We found 3 possibilities, Agent Fraser announced after an intense night of database searches. All 3 are private islands on remote lakes, all purchased through shell companies connected to names similar to Damien's known aliases. The first property was on Lake Winnipesaukee in New Hampshire, a 15-acre island with a main lodge and several guest cabins. The second was on Lake Champlain in Vermont, featuring a restored 1920s estate with modern security features. The third was on a smaller, unnamed lake in northern Vermont, accessible only by helicopter or amphibious aircraft. The third one, Agent Fraser said, pointing to aerial photographs, is the most isolated. The nearest road is 12 miles away and the lake isn't accessible by public boat launch. If Damien wanted complete privacy for his final phase, this would be the ideal location. Satellite imagery showed a substantial compound on the island, a main house, multiple outbuildings, what appeared to be a helicopter landing pad, and even a small dock. It looked more like a private resort than a family cabin. "How do we approach this?" asked Esther. "If we're wrong about the location, we waste time we don't have. If we're right but Damien sees us coming, he kills everyone immediately," I finished. Agent Fraser nodded grimly. "Which is why we need to be certain before we move. We're going to conduct aerial surveillance first. Look for signs of recent activity, vehicles, people." The surveillance mission took place the next morning using unmarked FBI aircraft flying at high altitude. The photographs they brought back were chilling but conclusive. 3 vehicles in the compound parking area, Agent Fraser reported, showing us the images. 2 SUVs and what appears to be a van. Heat signature analysis indicates at least 8 people in the main house and activity in 2 of the outbuildings. 8 people, Carrie calculated aloud. Damien, 3 new husbands, 3 wives. That's 7. Who's the 8th person? Agent Fraser consulted his notes. Possibly an associate we haven't identified yet. Or, he paused, it could be Michelle Fraser from Atlanta. The welfare check on her house in Atlanta was inconclusive. Neighbors thought she'd left voluntarily, with her husband, but we never confirmed she was actually with him. The tactical challenge was enormous. The island's isolation that made it perfect for Damien's criminal purposes also made it nearly impossible for law enforcement to approach without being detected. Any helicopter or boat approaching the island would be visible for miles across the open water. "We need a distraction," I said, studying the aerial photographs. Something that would explain why helicopters or boats might be in the area without raising suspicions. "Like what?" Agent Fraser asked. "Search and rescue operation," suggested Claude, her marketing background helping her think about plausible cover stories. "Report a missing hiker or boater in the area. That would justify multiple aircraft and boats without targeting the island specifically." "That could work," Agent Fraser agreed. "But we still need to get close enough to assess the situation before we move in. We need to know if those women are alive, if they're being held against their will, and where exactly they're being kept on the island." Carrie had been quiet during this discussion, but suddenly she looked up with a determined expression. "I have an idea, but you're not going to like it." "What are you thinking?" "Damien doesn't know that we've figured out his plan. As far as he knows, we're just grieving widows who discovered our husbands were criminals. What if one of us contacted him directly?" Agent Fraser shook his head immediately. "Too dangerous. If he realizes you're working with law enforcement? But what if he doesn't realize? What if I contacted him as Carrie Fraser, Simon's grieving widow who just discovered some confusing financial documents and needs help understanding what Simon was really involved in?" The plan was risky beyond measure, but it had one crucial advantage. It might be the only way to get real-time intelligence about the situation on the island before law enforcement made their move. "If we're going to do this," Agent Fraser said, reluctantly, "we need to do it perfectly. One mistake, one word that makes him suspicious, and those 3 women are dead." "Then we won't make any mistakes," I replied, though my heart was racing at the thought of putting Carrie in direct contact with the man who had orchestrated all our suffering. The most dangerous phase of our investigation was about to begin. The FBI's technical team spent 6 hours preparing for Carrie's call to Damien. They equipped her with a nearly undetectable transmitter, coached her extensively on maintaining her cover story, and set up real-time monitoring equipment that would allow the entire task force to listen to every word of the conversation. Remember, Agent Fraser said as Carrie sat in the specially prepared room. "You're a confused widow who found some documents she doesn't understand. You're scared, isolated, and looking for answers from someone Simon trusted. You know nothing about our investigation." Carrie nodded, though I could see her hands trembling slightly as she held the phone. We'd found Damien's contact information in Simon's hidden files, a number listed simply as DW, emergency contact. "What if he doesn't answer?" she asked. "Then we try again in an hour," Agent Fraser replied. But Thompson's testimony suggested Damien is very responsive to calls, from the wives, especially when they seem distressed. The technical team gave their final checks, confirming that all recording equipment was functioning and that the call could be traced in real time. Then Carrie dialed the number. It rang 3 times before a smooth, familiar voice answered. "Carrie, my dear, I was wondering when I might hear from you." The casual intimacy in Damien's tone made my skin crawl. He spoke to Carrie like an old friend, like someone who had every right to expect her call. "Damien," Carrie replied, and I was impressed by how genuinely confused and vulnerable she sounded. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I found some papers in Simon's office that I don't understand. Financial documents with numbers that don't make sense." "Oh, sweetheart." Damien's voice was full of practiced sympathy. "I can only imagine how overwhelming this must be for you. Simon always worried about leaving you to handle complex business matters on your own." "There are bank accounts I didn't know about," Carrie continued, following the script we'd developed. "Investment portfolios with amounts that seem too large, and some papers that mention your name. I don't know who else to ask." "Of course, dear. Simon and I had several business ventures together. I'm not surprised his paperwork would be confusing to someone outside the financial industry." Damien's tone was paternal, condescending in a way that suggested he viewed Carrie as a helpless widow in need of male guidance. "Could we meet somewhere to go over these documents?" Carrie asked. "I know it's a lot to ask, but I'm so lost without Simon." There was a pause, and I could almost hear Damien calculating his response. "Actually, Carrie, that's perfect timing. I'm currently hosting a small gathering for some of Simon's other business associates and their families. A kind of memorial retreat where we can all process our grief together and handle the practical matters of wrapping up Simon's affairs." The casual way he described what we knew was likely a captivity situation was chilling. Other business associates and their families, he was talking about the 3 missing women as if they were willing participants in some kind of grief counseling session. "That sounds wonderful," Carrie replied, injecting genuine relief into her voice. "I've felt so alone trying to figure all this out." "You're not alone, sweetheart. We're all family here, bound together by our connections to Simon and the others. Why don't you pack a bag for a few days? I'll send someone to pick you up. We're at a lovely retreat location where we can have complete privacy to discuss sensitive financial matters." "Should I bring Henry and Louisa?" Carrie asked, following our predetermined script. "Of course. The children should be part of this process. It's important they understand their father's legacy and their place in our extended family." Agent Fraser was already on a secure phone, coordinating with tactical teams. Damien's invitation to bring the children confirmed our worst fears. He wasn't planning to let anyone leave his retreat alive. "Where should I meet your driver?" Carrie asked. "There's a small airfield about an hour from your current location. I'll text you the address. My pilot will fly you up here this afternoon, and we can have everything sorted out by tomorrow." "By tomorrow?" Carrie's question sounded natural, but Agent Fraser was frantically signaling his teams. Damien's timeline was even more compressed than we'd feared. "Oh yes, dear. Simon's business matters are quite time-sensitive. There are financial obligations that need to be resolved quickly, and some legal requirements that can't wait much longer." After Damien ended the call with promises to text the airfield location, our task force erupted into controlled chaos. Agent Fraser was coordinating with multiple teams, while technical analysts traced the call and tracked the incoming text message with the meeting location. He's moving faster than we anticipated, Agent Fraser announced. If he's telling Carrie, everything will be sorted out by tomorrow. That means he's planning to complete his final phase within 24 hours. The insurance money, I realized. He's not waiting for natural-looking death spread out over time. He's planning some kind of mass casualty event that will trigger all the insurance policies simultaneously. Which means Sarah Whitmore, Jennifer, Cress and Michelle Fraser are running out of time, Esther added. Agent Fraser's phone buzzed with the text from Damien containing the airfield address. Ladies, we're about to execute the most dangerous rescue operation any of us have ever been involved in. If this goes wrong, it won't go wrong, Carrie said firmly, surprising us all with her determination. Damien has spent years manipulating women like us, using our trust and our love against us. It's time we turned our intelligence and our skills against him. The Widow's Revenge Squad rides again, Claude said with grim humor. But as Agent Fraser outlined the tactical plan for the rescue operation, I couldn't shake the feeling that Damien had been too accommodating, too willing to bring Carrie directly to his hidden location. Either he was supremely confident in his security arrangements, or he suspected our true purpose and was setting a trap of his own. In less than 3 hours, we would find out which scenario was correct. The FBI's tactical plan was elegant in its simplicity. While Carrie flew to the airfield as arranged, federal agents would already be in position around the remote lake. The helicopter that picked her up would be followed by unmarked aircraft, and underwater teams would approach the island from multiple directions while Damien's attention was focused on his newest guest. But plans, as I'd learned in my legal career, rarely survive contact with reality. We have a problem. Agent Fraser's voice crackled through the secure radio as our observation helicopter circled at maximum distance from Damien's island. Thermal imaging shows more people on the island than we expected. At least 12 heat signatures, possibly more. I adjusted my binoculars, watching the small aircraft that had picked up Carrie disappear toward the island's landing pad. 12 people. That's Damien, 3 new husbands, 3 wives. Who are the other 5? Unknown, but they're armed and positioned defensively around the compound. Damien was expecting us. The realization hit our team like a physical blow. Somehow, despite all our precautions, Damien had known that Carrie's call was a setup. Either he'd been more suspicious than we'd anticipated, or he had resources we hadn't discovered. Agent Fraser, I said into my headset, we need to consider the possibility that one of the women already on the island was able to send some kind of warning. If Sarah, Jennifer, or Michelle suspected what was happening, or, Agent Fraser replied grimly, Damien has been monitoring our communications somehow. Either way, Carrie is walking into a trap, and we need to move now. The tactical assault began at sunset, with FBI teams approaching the island from 3 directions. Underwater, divers emerged on the eastern shore, while helicopter teams prepared to fast rope onto the compound's main building. The plan was to create enough chaos and confusion to prevent Damien from executing his hostages while securing all civilians. From our observation position, I watched through high-powered scopes as the first explosions lit up the island. Flashbang. Grenades detonated around the compound's perimeter, followed by the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors as assault teams moved into position. But Damien had prepared for exactly this scenario. Multiple shooters on the main building's roof, reported the tactical team leader. They're using automatic weapons and have clear sight lines to all approach routes. Are any of the civilians visible? Agent Fraser demanded. Negative. All hostages. Appear to be in the main building's basement level, below our thermal imaging capability. The firefight that followed was brief but intense. Damien's security team was well-trained and heavily armed, but they were outnumbered and outgunned by federal agents who had been preparing for this operation for weeks. Building secured, came the report 20 minutes later. We have multiple suspects in custody, but Damien Whitmore is not among them. What about the hostages? We found them. All 6 women are alive, but drugged. They're being evacuated for medical treatment now? 6 women? I asked, confused. There should only be 4, Carrie, Sarah, Jennifer, and Michelle. Agent Fraser's voice was tense. The other 2 women? We don't know who they are yet, but based on their appearance and the documents found with them, we think Damien was already recruiting his next round of targets. Where's Damien? Gone. We found evidence of a helicopter departure within the last hour. He escaped while we were focused on the assault. As rescue helicopters evacuated the drugged women from the island, I realized that our victory was incomplete. We'd saved 6 lives and disrupted Damien's operation, but the man himself remained free to start over somewhere else, with new identities and new victims. Agent Fraser, I said as we watched the island compound burn in the distance, this isn't over. No, he agreed, but we hurt him badly tonight. We destroyed his network, seized his assets, and rescued his intended victims. Damien Whitmore is now a fugitive with limited resources and no infrastructure. But he's still alive, and he still has whatever money he managed to hide offshore. Then we'll find him, however long it takes. 3 weeks after the island rescue, our task force reconvened in a Boston hospital conference room. Carrie, Sarah Whitmore, Jennifer Kress, and Michelle Fraser were all recovering well from the drugs Damien had used to keep them compliant during their captivity. The 2 additional women, Rebecca Morrison and Lisa Chen, were still struggling. With the psychological trauma of discovering their entire marriages had been elaborate criminal setups. The medical exams confirmed our worst fears, Agent Fraser reported, consulting thick files. All 6 women showed evidence of being systematically drugged for weeks, possibly months. Damien had been using a combination of sedatives and psychoactive drugs to keep them docile while he prepared for his final phase. Sarah Whitmore, the corporate attorney from Chicago, was the first to speak. Despite her ordeal, she maintained the sharp professional demeanor that had made her valuable to Damien's operation. I remember fragments of conversations. Damien talking on the phone about insurance protocols and final asset transfers. He was definitely planning something catastrophic. He showed us documents, added Jennifer Kress, her voice still weak from the drugs. Insurance policies, bank account information, property deeds. He said we were all going to be taken care of and that our children would be provided for. At the time, I thought he was being generous. Michelle Fraser nodded agreement. He kept saying we were part of a special family now, that our husbands had made arrangements for our security. But there was something about the way he said it. I started to suspect we weren't guests. The 2 newest victims, Rebecca and Lisa, had the most disturbing stories. They'd been married to their respective husbands for less than a year, and both had been told they were being taken on surprise honeymoon trips that had turned into indefinite captivity. My husband told me we were going to a luxury resort, Rebecca said, still processing the betrayal. When we arrived at the island, Damien explained that it was a special retreat for investment professionals and their families. By the time I realized something was wrong, I was too drugged to do anything about it. Agent Fraser spread out financial documents across the conference table. We've recovered approximately $8 million in assets from various accounts controlled by Damien's network. The money will be returned to fraud victims, but there's still a substantial amount unaccounted for. How much? I asked. Conservative estimate? Damien had access to at least $15 million through offshore accounts and cryptocurrency holdings. He's not just a fugitive. He's a very wealthy fugitive. Carrie, who had been quiet throughout the briefing, finally spoke up. Agent Fraser, what about the children? Henry and Louisa, and the other children whose fathers were part of this network? All the children are safe and receiving counseling. We've arranged for victim services support and educational assistance to help them process what happened to their families. But what about their futures? Pressed Claude. These kids lost their fathers and learned their entire family histories. Were lies. What kind of support system do they have? Agent Fraser smiled slightly. the first positive expression I'd seen from him in weeks. Actually, that's something you should discuss among yourselves. The Victim Compensation Fund includes provisions for long-term family support, and there's been interest from several organizations about establishing a foundation specifically for families affected by this type of systematic fraud. I looked around the table at the other women, lawyers, marketers, bankers, professionals who had been targeted specifically for our skills and then nearly murdered for them. We'd been chosen as victims, but we'd proven to be remarkably effective. Survivors. Agent Fraser, I said, an idea forming. What would happen if we wanted to continue working together? Not just for our own recovery, but to help other victims of similar schemes? You mean like a permanent task force? More like a consulting organization. A group that could identify potential victims, assist law enforcement with investigations, and provide support for families dealing with the aftermath of romantic fraud schemes. Sarah Whitmore leaned forward, her legal mind engaging with the concept. We have the professional expertise that these criminals target: legal, financial, marketing skills. But now we also have the experience to recognize the manipulation tactics they use. We could prevent other women from going through what we went through, added Jennifer. Agent Fraser was nodding slowly. The FBI would definitely be interested in that kind of civilian expertise. You've proven you can work effectively with law enforcement, and your perspective as former victims would be invaluable. There's just one problem, Michelle said quietly. Damien is still out there. He knows who we are, what we look like, how we think. If we start actively working against people like him, we become targets again, I finished. Maybe, said Carrie, but we also become hunters instead of prey. The decision was unanimous. 7 women who had been systematically manipulated and nearly murdered would join forces to prevent others from suffering the same fate. The Widow's Revenge Squad was about to become something much more powerful and permanent. But first, we had to find Damien Whitmore and finish what we'd started. 6 months after the island rescue, our foundation, officially named the Professional Women's Fraud Prevention Alliance, had helped identify and prevent 12 additional romance fraud schemes across 7 states. We'd worked with the FBI to train agents in recognizing the specific targeting patterns used against professional women, and we'd established a network of support services for families affected by systematic romantic manipulation. But Damien Whitmore remained a ghost. The break came from an unexpected source, one of our own success stories. Amanda Wellington, a forensic accountant in Denver who had contacted our hotline about suspicious behavior from her investment advisor boyfriend, called with urgent information. He's been asking questions about your organization, Amanda reported during an encrypted conference call, specifically about the women who founded it. He wanted to know your backgrounds, your current locations, your security arrangements. My blood ran cold. Amanda, describe this man to me. Height, hair color, distinctive features. Tall, maybe 6'2", silver hair, very charming. He has this way of making you feel like you're the most interesting person he's ever met. And he mentioned that he'd worked with several other investment professionals who had married colleagues in the legal and marketing fields. It was Damien. Somehow he'd managed to establish a new identity and was already recruiting another victim, this time targeting a woman who was connected to our organization. Amanda, I said carefully, we need you to trust us on something very important. The key. Man you're dating is extremely dangerous, and we need your help to catch him. Working with Agent Fraser, we developed an operation that would use Amanda as bait to draw Damien into a controlled situation. She would agree to help him research our organization, claiming she could provide inside information about our security measures and daily routines. The trap was set at a high-end restaurant in downtown Denver, with FBI agents positioned throughout, the establishment and surveillance teams monitoring every entrance. Amanda wore a wire and followed a carefully scripted conversation designed to make Damien believe he was manipulating her into betraying us. These women think they're so smart, Damien said over dinner. his voice carrying the same condescending tone I remembered from Carrie's phone call. They have no idea how easy it is to identify their weaknesses. Professional success makes them arrogant, but it also makes them predictable. How so? Amanda asked, playing her role perfectly. They trust their own judgment too much. Show them the right credentials. Tell them what they want to hear about their expertise being valued, and they'll sign anything you put in front of them. I've been using that strategy for over a decade. The confession was everything we needed. As FBI agents moved in to make the arrest, Damien's final words were telling. You think you've won something here? There are dozens of men like me, hundreds of women like you. This business model is too profitable to die with one arrest. He was right about the broader problem, but wrong about us. During his trial, our foundation provided testimony that helped convict him on 47 counts of fraud, conspiracy, and attempted murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. More importantly, our organization had evolved into something Damien never could have anticipated. 7 women who had been chosen as victims because of our professional skills had become a force for protecting others. We'd helped law enforcement identify and shut down 3 additional fraud networks, prevented over 200 women from becoming victims, and recovered more than $30 million for fraud victims. You know what the best part is? Carrie said as we stood outside the courthouse after Damien's sentencing. He thought he was so clever, targeting professional women because we were successful and trusting. But our success wasn't just about our careers. It was about our ability to adapt, to learn, to fight back when we needed to. Henry and Louisa, now 12 and 9, had grown into remarkable kids despite the trauma of losing their father and learning the truth about his crimes. They called me Aunt Samantha and had fully embraced our extended chosen family of women who had survived the same betrayal. What happens now? Asked Sarah Whitmore, gesturing toward the courthouse where Damien would spend the rest of his life. Now we keep working, I replied. There are more Damiens out there, more women who need protection, more families who need support after this kind of betrayal. Simon had thought he was choosing a wife who would provide legal legitimacy for his crimes. Instead, he'd chosen someone who would use her legal expertise to ensure justice for his victims. Damien had thought he was eliminating threats to his operation. Instead, he'd created an alliance of women who had turned their pain into purpose. The widow's revenge was complete, but our work was just beginning. As we walked away from the courthouse together, 7 women who had been targeted for our success and had responded by becoming even more successful, I realized that sometimes the best revenge is simply refusing to be destroyed by those who tried to destroy you. Sometimes the best revenge is building something better from the ashes of their deception. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.